Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I did this drawing of a ferret in pastels. Now this video I'm going to have lots of tips on how to draw lighter fur, in particular how to draw fur similar to a yellow Labrador. Now to start with, I do like to begin with the eyes. This is where the main emotion and expression stems from. So once I've got that established, then I can start to work on the surrounding fur. Now one of my biggest tips when drawing eyes is if there is a bright highlight, I do like to use my white pencil first, just to make sure then that I've got that highlight as bright as it can be, and then I can darken it up later on. Now when it came to drawing the fur, I do find this one of the most challenging fur colours to get right. The fur can end up quite muddy and too dark if the layering process is incorrect. Now in most situations here I work more cautiously and I start with a bit more of my lighter colours and then I darken them up as I build my layers. Now you'll see throughout this tutorial that isn't always the case, but certainly for the most part here where the fur is lighter, I do like to use that approach. Now another thing here that I do like to focus on with any fur colour or texture is to get a blended base layer. Now how soft my base layer is going to massively impact the details that I add on top. The way that the base layer is established here, if there are any harsh start and stop points, then I do find that the details are also going to look far too rigid. So for me, as I build up my colour with this specific fur coloration, I do also try to get the softness between each of the colour changes. Now as I start to work with more of those lighter sections of the fur, you can see how gradual this layering process is. I'm focusing more on adjusting the colour in gradual stages just so that I don't then make those layers too dark. I might be using a little bit more of a muted green, some more yellow ochres, the occasional brown tint, and this is going to help for me to build up that contrast slowly. Now for me, this just makes the layering process much easier for how I like to work with pastels. Pastels are so beautiful for getting a soft blend, but this can also cause problems if those colours mix together too much. So using more of a cautious approach here is certainly my preference, and I really do feel that it adds a lot more depth. It's a bonus that it makes that layering process much easier. Now one of my biggest tips is we don't have to worry about trying to get the exact colour in the reference photo at this stage. There are going to be exceptions to that rule, for example, vibrant colours such as a red fox, but I do want to be making sure here that I'm focusing more on my contrast rather than the exact colour. Now if this reference photo was taken a few minutes later, maybe in a different setting or a flash was used, then the colour of that fur is going to look different. So as long as I've got my contrast right, my values, that then is going to make that drawing look more realistic rather than worrying about the exact colour. Now that being said, the colour is still important and how we pick those colours. We can really complicate that far too much if we're trying to fixate on one specific pencil. Whereas the real-time version of this tutorial really does show how to use a simple colour wheel system and how to limit the number of pencils that we can use. There really are a combination of pencils here that would work. It's about how to narrow that selection down to make that easier. Now if this real-time tutorial and the colour selection process is of interest in more of a step-by-step version of this lesson, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. Now when it comes to adding the detail, the bulk of my colour selection process has been done at my base layer stage. I'm not necessarily picking the colours for the details to replicate or reinforce more of that colour in the reference photo. So this would be one of my biggest tips when drawing this kind of fur colour, is we do want to try to establish more of that at the underlayers rather than trying to fix it with the details. Because the details on top here in most cases are always usually more of a lighter colour. So if we're trying to darken a colour or make it more rich, that's harder to do with the details when they're more spaced apart. Now this is a smaller drawing, only 6 by 8 inches, but despite that I've still been able to capture a high level of realism because the pencil technique and the layering process is right. If I didn't have good contrast here and my values were off, then I want to be making sure here that I go back at my base layer stage and reinforce it before I get too carried away with the details. Now if I start adding details here and they're not really showing up, that tells me that my base layer isn't correct. The base layer needs to be dark enough in order for my lighter pencil strokes, those important details, to show up. Now when I start to work with those details, I'm paying very close attention to three main things: the fur length, fur thickness, and fur direction. Now the fur direction is never random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So for example, how it curves around the eyes is indicating at the eye socket. Where it starts to change and curve over the centre of the nose, that's therefore showing the bridge of the nose, and where it slopes down towards the cheek. The top of the head here is going to have more of a curved appearance as it goes over towards the ears, to make it look like it's then curving over the skull. So the main fur directional changes I do like to get accurate. I'm not trying to force in all of the directional changes with a smaller drawing, I just don't have the space. But as long as I've got the key changes, this is going to still have that high level of realism I'm aiming for. And the order of those layers are also important. If I notice the fur changing in a different direction, I'll sit there and reassess that reference photo and think, is that because the layer of fur is on top of the current layer I'm working on? If it is, I'll leave that for a later layer. This will really enhance the level of depth that is captured. Now when drawing the ears of any animal, the shape of that ear and how it's replicated is crucial. Now for the upright ear position here, I want to be making sure that I've got a darker centre and it gets lighter at the edges. That's going to give me a bit more of a curved, more of a dish-like shape. So here where I'm starting to build up those values, you can see that I'm replicating that. Now again, just like the fur, I've worked with more of a cautious approach and started with my lighter colours, and then I'm darkening it from there. The reason being, the centre of this ear was not really dark. It didn't have any black shadow. So I was able to build up the colours here more cautiously. Now if the ear had a very dark centre, then that would be different. I would be more than happy to work dark to light. But for something like this, where there's more of a warmer glow coming through the back of the ear, this is my preference. Now to really show this technique further, I have a rabbit tutorial here on YouTube that has a beautiful backlit glow and makes that inner ear colour really vibrant. So if you would like to see the techniques for that, then I'll link the video to that in the description below. Now at this stage of the layering process, I could technically call this finished. I've got a nice level of detail. I've also got my values right. However, by adding in a few more layers of my lighter pencils, I can then really hype up that contrast that much more. But it's really important here that I'm keeping this softness. So my pencil strokes, I don't want to be using too much pressure. Those details will then look too thick. I want to be getting that balance just right. For a smaller area, I also need to be making sure that I don't add too many details because it will actually cover up the layers underneath. I'll therefore make those darker layers look lighter by pulling in these brighter details. So the balance and how much we're adding really is something we should be paying attention to at each layer. Now when I come in with the highlights at this later stage, I want to be making sure that I'm paying very close attention to the exact placement of the highlights and shadows. Now this isn't random, just like the fur direction. The placement of a highlight, for example, over the top of the eye would be indicating at the eye socket. Now if the highlight section of hair above the eye was too low, then I'm actually dropping the eye socket as well. So again, this would actually drastically change the shape of the face. Now I've spoken a lot about how important the fur direction is, but the length of the pencil strokes is also just as crucial. An area around the nose on most animals are going to be that much shorter than everywhere else on the face. There are of course exceptions. A cockapoo, for example, they still have fairly longer, curlier fur around their nose, but generally it's going to still be longer on the tops of the head and the cheeks. Now in order to capture this correctly on shorter coated animals, the details here around the nose might only be 1 millimetre or 2 long. In some cases we might only have to do dots, but again this is one aspect that's very individual to each photo. However, the layering process here is very similar. Because the fur was lighter around the nose, I'm working more cautiously and first of all trying to reinforce the colour at my base layer stage. Once I'm happy with that and I've also got the softness right, then I can start considering the details, the length of the pencil strokes and the thickness of the pencil strokes. Now the length of the pencil strokes here could change very quickly, so here where it's starting to then drape over to the side of the face, the cheek area, the fur is a little bit longer than that directly next to the nose. So it might only be an area that is 1 inch wide, but from the right side over to the left, we need to be adjusting the pencil strokes accordingly. On this side of the face, where the face is actually turned more on a slight angle, you can't see as much of the length of the fur at all. So here it might be more shading or some of those little dots that I've just mentioned. Forcing too much detail or longer pencil strokes on the right hand side in this situation would actually make the face look more flat, more sort of like turned towards the viewer, which obviously would then not match the rest of the fur elsewhere. So this is certainly something that I do focus on, as much so as the fur direction and that fur thickness. Now fur thickness is actually something I'm going to focus more on in the body section in a moment of this tutorial, because that fur there is more out of focus. The details are nowhere near as harsh. Now when working with a finer line here, the fur details need to be very thin, so the lighter pressure, sharper point is my preference. But fur that is thicker, more clumped together, we don't want to be working with more of that sharper point because we're more likely to add in more definition. Working with a blunt pencil and making that process easier for the details just helps to simplify that aspect. Now the pencil technique is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my real-time step-by-step lessons. Because I create those with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm able to explain everything in the moment. So if any of those are of interest, then as I say, I will link the information to that in the description below. Now when drawing fur that is out of focus and a little bit blurry, having a soft base layer here is of course going to help with that effect far earlier on in that layering process. Now I'm being very bold here with the colours that I'm using, starting off with the black and then building in some of those muted browns next to it. However, when I start to work with capturing more of the colour saturation, I'm going to add that on top of this very first layer. The reason being, it's not overly vibrant, unlike something such as the red fox that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Now, if you would like to see that layering process, then I've got a video of a red fox tutorial here on YouTube, and the approach there is very different. The way that we are using the colours need to be adjusted, so I'll link that video in the description below if that is of interest. But one thing I am still doing here is following the placement of the highlights and shadows, just so that I know I've got my initial base foundation as accurate as it can be, and it just makes that following of the reference photo much easier. Now once that base was in, I've started to add a little bit of a subtle green tint and then coming over the top with my yellow ochres. And this again is where I'm adjusting the colour before I consider any impression of texture or detail. Now as I start to enhance more of the colour saturation here, I deliberately want this to be mixing in with the browns, which is why I started with the tan layer first. Now one tip when drawing lighter fur colour such as this or a yellow Labrador, a golden retriever, those fur colours can be very reflective. So it's not uncommon for them to have colours in the environment that are bouncing back into the fur, such as this green tint here. Now, if I'm not adding any grass, I would normally remove or tone down that green tint in the fur. However, in this situation, the ferret being an animal that is lower to the ground, it would make sense here that I would have more of this colour visible. Whereas for a Labrador or a golden retriever that sat more upright, further away at chest level, if it is perched up on all 4 feet, then I would be happier to tone down or remove completely the green reflection. But this is very individual and it's something that I would have a discussion with the owner if it was a pet portrait commission and find out exactly what their thoughts are on that. Now going back to drawing out of focus fur, one of my biggest tips here is not to work with overly sharp pencils. There are times when I'm using a light pink and that's got far more of a sharper point, and you'll see that some of those details I'm having to then soften with my finger, and that's because the point of the pencil is already indicating at more definition. Whereas this yellow, it's more rounded at the point, it's able to give me more softness. This is going to really speed up and help this technique when drawing blurry fur. Now it's also making sure that I don't over soften it or over blend, because out of focus fur, we have a tendency in some cases to overdo that. So I still want to have the impression of some definition, more clumps of fur rather than individual details. But again, this is going to be very individual to each reference photo. Now, if I do feel like I've added in too much detail, pastels are a very forgiving medium. We can just either soften with our finger or come back in with additional pencils and actually go over some of those details. That will actually help to almost sort of push or widen those details out slightly and give more of a thicker pencil stroke. And that thicker pencil stroke is exactly what we want for this kind of fur. Now, one of the very last elements that I like to add to my portraits are the whiskers. They do overlap everything else, so it is a layer that I leave until the very end. The only reason being, if the whiskers are added in too soon, it's far harder, more fiddly to then adjust the fur underneath if that isn't finished. Now, I do have a couple of videos here on YouTube that all go through tips and techniques on how to create these longer, finer lines. I'll also link one or two of those in the description below as well. If you do have any art-related questions, anything specific to the technique or the layering process, then feel free to pop any questions in the comments below. I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this tutorial, I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.